we had to innovate ourselves and create something new that could carry us through a pandemic if everything went to shit. And I step onto the floor with great vigor, and I say hello to some nice faces and some black boxes. I'm quite curious about who's hiding behind the boxes. If you want to show your beautiful face and wave at me, that would be nice. Oh, nice. Here's people. Awesome. Okay, so my name is Jacob, and I have been invited to share a story and try to link that story to a broader overall theme around innovation. Because I am every single day I'm trying to figure out how innovation works. As part of my job, I run a small consultancy called Braver here in Oslo, and we basically work with big corporates who want to create new stuff, so new services, new products, new business models, you name it. And then we also spin out our own startups whenever we come across ideas that we believe in. So innovation is sort of on my mind and on my calendar and agenda at all times. And we're trying to figure out how that works, both for our customers and for ourselves. And then something happened about a year ago that you may have heard about. There was this dude in somewhere in China who decided to boil some soup on a bat, and that caused some havoc around the world with a virus thing that's been going on, and that basically freaked us out in our company. So we had to innovate ourselves and create something new that could be that could carry us through a pandemic if everything went to shit. So this is the story of basically how we did that and how we took an idea from nothing to what has it been now, a few million NOK in revenue in about a year, and we built a team around it, and it basically helped us turn what looked like the worst year of our company's history to the best one so far. And I brought this story and this case with me not because I want to show you what geniuses I work with or anything like that, but because I think it's generally a decent example of how innovation, what it can actually look like in practice, because innovation is a topic and a discipline that is very often talked about in theoretical terms, or even worse, in just a load of buzzwords and words that don't really mean anything. So my goal here is to basically show a real world example, and hopefully you can apply the lessons from this case to your own work in the future. So I'm going to make this extremely simple in terms of agenda. I am going to share the story and the case, and then I'll just open for questions, and don't do anything more more creative than that. So we'll see where this goes. And I'm also open. I have the chat right in front of me, so if I'm able to multitask throughout this, I can also pick up any questions along the way, or comments or whatever. And you can also just scream and shout if you unmute yourself at any point. Sounds good?
Sounds amazing.
Oh yeah. I get several thumbs up and a Superman voice. So that's a good sign. Okay. So the case study that I brought with me is something called remote work. And this is a project under our company, Braver. It could have been its own company, but we decided not to spin it out yet. But for all intents and purposes, you can just look at this as a new company being started. And what I'm going to do is to take you through a very quick and dirty timeline of the last year. And this timeline in gray is going to follow us throughout the presentation. And it starts around March 1st, maybe even a couple of days before that. Last year, when my co-founder and I had read some international news about COVID, and we sort of felt like we were 2 or 3 weeks ahead of most people we knew in terms of like freaking out about what this might become. So this was like some time before it was on the radar, so to speak, or in the mainstream in Norway. But we basically read all these news from China and from other places in Asia, and we thought, okay, this is clearly doesn't know geographical boundaries. If it comes over here, it might be a problem in some capacity. So we thought a lot about this, and on March 6th, I wrote a newsletter to all of our followers, and it looked like this. It's in Norwegian, unfortunately, so I'll translate. It basically says thoughts on COVID, quarantine, black swan, and maybe a crisis. And I got my good friend Frederick to illustrate this. And this is a picture, a drawing of me having stocked up my basement with tomatoes and basic goods in case of a complete crisis. And we sent this out on March 6th. And what we basically wrote was that there is now some percentage chance that we are facing something that might become a global pandemic. If that happens, here are a few scenarios that we think might play out. And in either of those scenarios, here are a few things we think you, the reader, should do to prepare, both for yourself as an individual and for your companies or for your colleagues or your work in some capacity. And now I have my first question. Woo! Was it published in any newspapers? No, it was not. This was only sent out to our private email list. But if anybody wants to read it, I can find a link afterwards. Me, okay. Try to remind me at the end, and I'll find the text somewhere. And so we basically just wrote out what we thought might happen in a good, bad, and a terrible scenario, and sort of what we recommended you do about it. And at this point, if everybody was just laughing at us, right? This was super far out. We were just spreading fear and loathing, and that was, why was that constructive? Just shut up was basically the response from quite a few people. And mind you, this is after we've been sort of discussing this with our friends and people we know for like 2 weeks, and everyone is already pissed about these two guys who are going into crisis mode for no reason at all. So that's sort of where the story starts. And the backdrop before this is sort of, or the context that we stood in at this point in time, was that we had been full-time on our company for a year and a half. We'd been doing it part-time for a couple of years before that, while also running another startup and doing consulting and stuff. But then we'd gone all in, and we'd sort of done it for 18 months. It had been a lot of ups and downs, and we were just sort of about to find some sense of stability in the business. We landed our first big client a few months before, and things seem to be sort of finally smoothing itself out a little bit. And then then we see this COVID thing coming on the horizon, and we're thinking, okay, this might be trouble. So this newsletter goes out, and then this was a lot of fun to make this this keynote, because I scrolled back through our old Slack channels and basically looked at what we were communicating to each other a year ago. And I've brought some screenshots to sort of show what we were thinking, and I'll translate these in real time. So here is my co-founder on March 9th. So we've been discussing maybe we should just like leave town and run away somewhere, because if this goes badly, it's probably not a lot of fun to be in Oslo. So Christer says, is your dad's cabin a place we might camp? So then I say, yeah, that's a pretty decent idea, but we might have some like Gantt chart dependencies. So first, my dad wants to go to the cabin and fix some stuff before we go there. And I don't want to be at the cabin at the same time as him. Instead, in case I am infected with COVID, and he's an old dude, right? So I didn't want to put him at any risk. So that's March 10th. And then, see, here we go. I tell Freddie, my other colleague, the day after that we're just leaving town tomorrow. The day after tomorrow, we're leaving town. We're bunkering up on the cabin on an undecided time horizon. So we're just gonna disappear for a while. So we knew that we had Wi-Fi at the cabin, and that was pretty much what we needed. So this is our plan. And 2 days later, we rent a van. We fill it up with like, I think we bought groceries for like 30,000 kroner or something ridiculous. So we just filled up this car with loads and loads and loads of food and toilet paper and the basics and our computers. And then we headed for the coast. And it looked like this. So this is Chris, my partner in crime, with some of our supplies. And here you can see we have the most important things: toilet paper, crackers, knekkebrød in Norwegian, and 2 guitars. So that's us setting in, heading out for the sunset and into safety away from town. And this was just about the time when sort of Norway figured out that shit, maybe this is real, you know? So we leave just as everybody else starts to freak out. So we go out to this lovely place in on the coast, and then we sit there and we start thinking, and we start doing scenario planning. And now I have been publicly called a toilet paper king in the chat. So I think that is a milestone in my life. So yeah, we sit down at the cabin and we do scenario planning, and we basically map out 3 possible scenarios. One of them is good, one of them is medium, and one of them is terrible. This is mostly for the company, but since we're basically, our personal finance and many parts of our lives is so tied to the company that it would also be shit for us if everything went down the drain. But again, we can see from Slack that we still had some hope. So this is Christer, stay strong, guys. And he says, this is an insane crisis to experience as a tiny company. I think we'll be able to make some smart choices in the coming time. So that's sort of where we're at this point. And the reason we're a little bit scared is of these bad case scenarios is that we think we have a hypothesis that says buying innovation projects is probably not going to be top of mind for anyone if there's a massive pandemic, because we thought in that scenario most of our customers and everybody else in business will probably have more than enough with just sort of like trying to hold on to their core business and figure out how not to crash. And since we we basically sustain ourselves by selling innovation projects, we thought that's not a good situation to be in. So we wanted to come up with something that would basically act as a hedge against COVID. So we thought if the pandemic gets out of hand, or if this becomes a real thing, we want to come up with some kind of value proposition or some kind of service or product that will be more in demand the more the pandemic goes crazy. So that was sort of the dream of this scenario planning impromptu strategy session. So what we did then was to go problem hunting. And that is just a fancy word for sitting down, drinking a lot of coffee, and trying to figure out what kinds of problems might a global pandemic bring with it. And then drink some more coffee and try to take the subset of that list to try to identify if there were any problems at all that COVID could cause, that we had any any good reason to solve, or any skills to solve, or any capacity to solve, or to help solve for customers who could pay for solutions. So we really wanted to figure out what was in the middle here. Obviously in the red box, we came up with all kinds of things, like people dying and stuff like that. But we're not particularly good at saving lives in intensive care units. So we had to dig deeper. And after some long sessions, we landed on the best hypothesis we had was that a pandemic will lead a lot of people to have to suddenly start working from home. And if in hindsight, this sounds blatantly obvious, right? But in March, this was still not really a thing. So we thought that that's probably going to lead everybody to have to work from home overnight. And if that happens, that is not going to be easy for people to do, or that's going to be there's going to be friction involved for an entire workforce of knowledge workers to overnight change pretty much everything about how they work. And we thought we had some capacities and some skills that could help reduce that friction. So with that in mind, we figured out that we should make a play on remote working as a trend, and basically try to help organizations be better at working together remotely. So again, some Slack screenshots. Christer, let's talk to Andy, which is our third partner, tomorrow. I guess he's gonna be down on remoting, something related to remote work. And then an hour before, Christer wrote he thinks the entire business sector, Næringsliv, is gonna go into remote mode on March 9th. So what we do then is that we create the first start of any project. We create an official Slack channel called Remote Work, and we start to look for Norwegian words. Is there any Norwegian word for remote work? Was an important question. We didn't come up with any. So instead, freelance. Yeah. So instead, we just bought the domain remotework.no and went to work. And here we had some other hypotheses. Christer says, I assume a lot of consultancies are gonna have problems pretty fast. Remote work, here's sort of the first hint that we should get this domain. So we buy the domain and then we go into prototype mode or testing mode, which is also known as trying and failing. So we're a little step further along our timeline. And one of the first things we did was to put up this website called Koronadugnad. And dugnad is a very extremely typical, quintessential Norwegian word. And it basically means the process of people coming together to solve a common challenge. It's most typically sort of come and pull weeds out of your neighbor's garden, or come help out at the farm or something like that. But we figured we should make a COVID dugnad. So this COVID dugnad was very simply a form where you could fill in the things that your organization was doing to prevent COVID. So the situation in Norway at this point in time was that, so this is a few days later, and our hypothesis about home office was basically verified overnight. And what happened then was that, or before everyone was sent home actually, there were pretty much every big organization started to implement some sort of COVID measures, but they were not standardized or centralized in any way. So each company sort of came up with their own things to implement. So some would stop going on the tram. Others would recommend their employees to stay at home before that was mandatory. Some would put out extra soap everywhere. There were all these kinds of things, right? Some were creative, some were kind of boring. So, but everybody was trying to figure out their own things to do. So what we realized was that instead of everyone trying to figure out these things for themselves, let's just create a COVID dugnad and set up this form where you could basically fill in what organization you work for and what kinds of things was being done at your company. And then we got this long list of basically a crowd-funded list of everything that was going on. And then we shared that list with everyone who had contributed. So people could just jump into the list and then see what was happening at other companies and implement similar things. So this was a fun project that we put up basically like in a day or two. And we didn't make any money off of this. It was just a nice thing to do. But suddenly people were really happy that we had sort of helped them out and taken some kind of position against this COVID thing. Especially our friends we had been whining about the the virus to way before nobody really cared. Suddenly they came back and said, maybe we're onto something. And then the next thing we did after this, so again, we didn't really make any money off of this, but we got loads of contacts. So we had like, I don't know, maybe 150, 200 people who had contributed to this dugnad and were now on some kind of email list. And a few days later, we figured we had to try something new because while this was a nice thing to do, right? It doesn't really make a lot of sense to try to make money off of a dugnad. As Norwegians will know, it doesn't jive too well. So after that, we put up a bare-boned version of remotework.no, which basically just contained some info about, hello, we are an innovation studio. We have some people on our team who's really good process facilitators, meaning they're they're essentially experts at telling teams how to work well together to succeed in achieving their goals. And they had been working digitally for a long time before COVID hit, and sort of been acting as digital facilitators for a while. So we figured we could sell their expertise to companies who wanted to work better together digitally. So we put up this website, and it basically said, hello, we have this digital process experts. Here you can book a coaching call, and we can share how to work smart remote, blah, blah, blah. And again, as it says at the bottom, trying and failing, that didn't really work at all. We got like 3 calls, and that was about it. And here we see that we discuss on Slack again that we're trying to do some coaching stuff, and we figured out that we should make a course. Maybe we had an idea for a course and maybe a coaching track for the entire leadership group of a company. There's all these ideas being played around with. And what's really happening here is that we're sort of spinning around this lean startup circle that you might have seen before if you've done any entrepreneurship stuff, where you basically have this idea that what you should do in the early stages of any startup venture, before you have what is known as product market fit, before you know that the market will pay for your idea or your solution, is that you should start here at the top, build something, typically what is known as an MVP, minimum viable product. And that can be a prototype, it can be just a website explaining what you want to offer to the world, whatever. And then you show that prototype to customers, people who you think might be in the customer group. And then you measure their response, and then you learn from that response. And then based on that learning and that insight, you tweak on your prototype. So you build some more, and then you basically just spin around until you hit something that customers want to pay for. So that's kind of what we're doing here, right? So first we built Corona Dugnad up here, and then we showed that to a lot of people. We measured the response, and we learned that this was very helpful, but it wasn't a viable business opportunity. So we built some more, went back up to build, and we built this remote work website where we said, hello, we can coach your team on how to be a good remote team. And then we measured the response to that, which was sort of meh style response. And then we learned from that, and then we tweaked the prototypes again, and so on and so forth. And here's worth noting that there are many ways to do this, many ways to test an idea or to see if you're working on a problem that is worth solving. So here I've brought with me a few of them from actually a different presentation that we do in this startup school that we run for students once a year. And we have this slide here that basically shows a few ways you can go about testing a startup idea. So here are a couple. The top one is exactly what I showed you on the previous slide. Basically put up a quick and simple website that explains your idea and see what people say when they go to that website and see how they react. You can make a super basic prototype from cardboard. You can put up a webinar where you talk about the problem you're solving and your solution and your ideas to see if anybody cares. Or you can solve the problem manually, or buy some Facebook ads and measure how many people click on them to see if anybody cares. Or you can just talk about your idea to people, and instead of just asking for feedback, you can be a little bit more aggressive, arguably, or a little bit edgier, and ask them to pay upfront to become the first customer. And then you can say, I'll deliver the solution in 6 months. And if they then give you money, you have very strong signals or validation for your idea. But if they say, no, I don't actually want to give you money, then you can you can try to ask why, because that's typically what happens. And then you do that until you hit something that shows potential in the market. So again, we did another test as well that finally got us a lot of attention, which we thought was a good sign. And that was to put up this webinar. So we made this webinar that was called Learn How to Facilitate a Digital Workshop. And we had some text explaining what you would learn in the webinar. It would last for 45 minutes. You would learn this and that. You would meet our process facilitators up here. And you would basically learn how to make a boring video call into an exciting workshop was the pitch. And then I remember this vividly because we bought some Facebook ads quite late one night. And we pointed those ads to this webinar. And then we went to bed down in the cabin. And then we woke up the next morning to a nice sunny day. And when we opened our computers, our Slack just exploded. It just went ballistic. Because what had happened then was that like hundreds and hundreds of people over the last 15 hours or so had signed up for this webinar. So we knew then that we were probably onto something because we hit such a nerve and got so much interest. And what we see here is a screenshot of our webinar platform where we can see that we did the same webinar on multiple occasions throughout April and May. And we had like 600 people, 900 people, 400, 500, 600 people on each, signed up for each of them. So in total, we got like 2,500 people's contact information and email addresses, and they participated in this webinar. And then we figured, okay, there is probably something here since that many people want to spend an hour of their life watching this. So let's try to do something more about it. So what we did then was to create a new website or update the one we had to say, hello world, we have a digital course. And this course will teach you how to become a workshop facilitator, a digital one. So the webinar would sort of give you a very, very basic introduction. And then if you wanted to go deeper, you could sign up for this course, which would take 2 half days and you would learn all kinds of things. So we put up this website and we hadn't made the course at all, but we figured if somebody buys it, we will make it. That was sort of the plan. So we talked about the full course during the short webinars. And what happened was that we had our first sale, our first taste of market validation. So this is a bill that we sent out to Kristin for 5,000 kroner to participate in this course. And that was a nice milestone, but you can't really get too far on 5,000 kroner. But luckily, this is what happened as the next 2 months rolled around. So we got a few sales in April, and then in May and June, it kind of took off to the extent that we had to scale up the team, get more people on board. So these guys were now working only on the remote work project, and things were looking very, very fine and glorious and awesome, as mentioned in the chat. This, I mean, if I'd held this talk on June 31st or 30th, 2020, this would have pretty much been the end of the sunshine story, right? And this would have, all arrows would have been pointing up to the right, and it would have been just brighter, such a bright future that you had to wear shades. But unfortunately, it wasn't that smooth of a ride in reality, because what happened was this. So obviously July, nobody's thinking about work, in Norway at least. But in August, by the time we went into holiday break, we basically didn't have any sales at all. So here we had to think, okay, what do we do now? Do we shut the project down? Do we just say this was a great little stunt in the middle of the first COVID wave and we're done, put our chips off the table and go back to our other things? But we didn't do that. Instead, we decided to give it another go to see if we could sort of revive it in the fall. And luckily we did that, because the fall was even better. And if we split these into some different colors, you can get a sense of the sort of business development that was happening in the project. Because what we have here is color-coded revenue by what we sold, basically. So you have the initial course, the workshop course, in blue. And this was the course where you could sign up as a single person and be like, hey, I want a spot in this course. And then you would take it with 10, 11 other people, randoms that you didn't know, and then you would sort of learn together. And then pretty quickly into May or June, we realized that it was much more lucrative if we could sell what we call internal courses, which is exactly the same course, but you can't sign up as a single person. You can only buy it for a team within an organization. So 10 people, 12 people take it together. So that sort of took over, and then we shut down the individual signups completely as we got to after the summer. And then what we see here in yellow is kind of interesting, because this is just the random category. So what happened is that we sort of became the remote work guys. And what happened then was that people started approaching us with all kinds of weird requests. So they would be like, you guys are the remote dudes, right? Yeah, great. So we have this, we're going to have a Christmas table. We have employees in 12 countries, and we would like it to be more fun than a Teams meeting. Can you make it fun for us? So that was a big part of this chunk, like this big Christmas meeting. And then somebody in October said, so we're a big global shipping company, and we are really bored of not being able to do any strategic work together. Can you facilitate a week-long strategy session where we're going to make the plans for the next 5 years? So we did that, and all these sort of random things just came in and filled up our time. So that was great. Did you start selling all toilet paper? I still actually have quite a bit of toilet paper in my basement. So no, we left the cabin after 2 months or so we didn't shit through all of it, unfortunately. Keep it as a memory. Yeah, I'll frame it. Let me see. Selena, how did you go about reviving it? Yeah, good question. So initially, we basically relied on Facebook ads to get thousands of people to this webinar. And that basically happened in April and May and June. And then we shut down the webinar funnel because people started going into holiday mode. And then what we did in September was to launch a series or an email campaign, basically an email marketing campaign, where we started to communicate with all the people who had signed up for the webinars in the past, because we hadn't really done a lot of communication with those people. So we started talking about not really, hey, we have a course, click here to buy it, but instead we started sharing our thoughts on the future of work and how we think the work day of tomorrow is going to be, and how we think that remote is here to stay in some capacity, even if we all get a vaccine. And we started sort of sharing that narrative, and then a lot of customers seemingly believed the same things. And then we were sort of an obvious solution to help them move in that direction. So that drove most of the growth here. And this leads me to my favorite graph of 2020, which is this one, which is basically remote work revenue plastered on top of the COVID cases in Norway. And if you remember, initially I said that in our strategy/crisis session, when we did the scenario planning, what we really wanted to do was to create a hedge against COVID, so that the more COVID spread, the better we would do, basically. And I think this graph shows that we actually managed to do that relatively well. And then luckily for us, the pipeline for innovation projects picked up pretty fast as well. So then we got a sort of double effect, especially at the last half of the year. Let me see. With the mainly companies, we had courses for the random income. So the yellow ones here, the question is if the customers were mainly companies where we'd had courses in the past. So I would say probably about half of it is people who came back after the course. And then the other half are sort of random people who had been through a webinar or heard of us in some way. So yeah, the hedge worked. And at this point, this is sort of remote work as it stands right now. It's become basically the go-to provider for remote facilitation and courses and all kinds of other random things that we've never really promoted, but people seem to think we know something about. And it's a really important project for us in Braver, obviously. And it now has its own team, its own brand, and it's soon ready to be spun out either as a separate company or to be sold to some other company that is bigger. So that's sort of the status quo at the moment. And again, just to reiterate the point I made at the beginning, I think this is a relatively good example of how you can turn a crisis or a problem into an opportunity that you can capitalize on if you're able to basically use the method of identifying problems, making some hypotheses about problems that are coming in the future or that are already here, and then try to craft some sort of value proposition or offering or service or product that you can provide to the market to solve that problem, and then basically try and fail at different solutions and different things until you hit something that shows any potential, and then double down, basically, to simplify it to the perverse. So that's pretty much the end of this story. And I don't know how much time I have in this session, to be honest, but if there are any questions, I am happy to try to answer at least. And if you have questions in audio instead of chat, that is a little more fun and engaging.
I have a question. Can I go?
Go for it.
Yeah. Okay. So I wonder, was it hard to establish some sort of like a market, customers, or wasn't that of a big problem? Because your idea and your startup is basically very, very innovative in Norway, and I haven't came across anything similar to this. So this is why I wonder.
Yeah, I think we were pretty lucky with the timing for the first webinar experiments that we did, because this was the time when everyone had literally like overnight been moved to a home office that they'd never done before. And most leadership groups didn't really know how to lead remotely at all. Everybody was sort of like hair on fire stress mode. So there was no, in most organizations, there was no like clear communication or expectations about what people should do, how they should work together. It was all just chaos. So I think a lot of people had a lot of questions, and there was a lot of confusion, and also many people had a lot of time in their workday that they didn't really know what to do with, because routines weren't established yet. So I think we tapped into that, and when we saw that it worked, when we saw that we paid reasonable prices for Facebook ads to get the first, let's say, 200 signups, then we basically just doubled down and spent a lot of money on ads, with the hypothesis that if we could just like rack up as many people who are interested in this topic as humanly possible in this window of opportunity, then we had faith that we would be able to monetize that on the back end later in some form.
Anna, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. So I wanted to ask, like, what do you think were the qualities, or perhaps it's the experience, that made you and your team so able to really quickly capture the problem and think, okay, this is time to pivot? Whereas most people were like very confused about where this is and probably didn't realize that until late March, which gave you a really good heads up on these things, and you were able to just adapt and not really freak out in a sense.
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons. One is that we basically we didn't really have a choice, because at this point we basically had one big customer, a big shipping company we were working with, and we in that contract there was a force majeure clause that basically says if there's any like extreme unforeseen circumstance, the client can cancel the contract. So we were looking at this and thought, okay, COVID clearly qualifies as that, right? If this thing blows up. So we were kind of freaking out about that, and we thought if they cancel this, we're toast basically, unless we do something. So there was a pretty strong motivation to get something to work. And then I think it also helps that we've been working, or we've sort of used these startup methods on a regular basis, and that is kind of the value proposition that we sell to corporates as well. So it would be kind of awkward if we were like incapable of executing the things that we've been telling other people to do for years. So that probably helped a little bit as well. But yeah, a lot to lose, and basically no kids to take care of or anything else. So we just like worked around the clock until we hit something. Anna, is your hand up a second time, or is it the last
second time?
Okay, bring it on.
Yeah, sorry for a lot of questions. It's just really interesting. I like the idea. So I'm really interested in what is your next step, as in like, do you guys plan to maybe broaden your business to the Scandinavian countries or England, since it's closer with the language?
Right. Yeah, we thought about that. We might do it. We haven't done it because of capacity issues, basically. But it's on the backlog of ideas, to put it that way. But what we realized is that Norway is kind of a special market because we have a big public sector, which surprisingly enough is quite eager to learn this stuff. And they have like loads of the budgets for training and things like that. So almost, I think 70% of our customers in the remote work project has been public sector clients. And it's probably similar-ish in other places, but I think it's in particular a particular thing about Norway that A, the public sector is so big, B, it has so much money, and C, it's this notion of working well digitally is actually on the agenda for many of these organizations. Go. There's also a sign up link on this page, but that one doesn't work anymore because we changed email providers. So you have to go to Braver if you want to sign up. But they're all in Norwegian though.
And another question from Anna.
Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah, we've actually run a few months ago, 1 month ago, 1.5 months ago. We did a workshop called Designing Your Life for students, which was basically applying, it's based on a course at Stanford called the same thing, and a book by 2 professors over there at the design school. And it's basically about how to apply design principles and prototyping and testing and iterations to your life and your lifestyle instead of to a product or a service. So that's something we might do again at some point, but I recommend the book called Designing Your Life by Bill Burnett and some other guy, if you're interested in that theme. And then we also, see, I can link to that as well. If any of you are, this is also in Norwegian, unfortunately, but we have something called Early Stage. Oops, that almost worked. Something called Early Stage, which is basically a 6-week startup program for students that we run twice a year. So that's as close as we get to working with students on a regular basis.
Farah?
Okay, another question from me is, once you started, let's say, a new idea and you're testing it out, or let's say you tested it, kind of worked a bit and then just flopped, when do you know it's time to give up on an idea that you have? Because I think once you start something new, it's sort of like your baby, so it's hard to give up on it. When do you know that, okay, this is not going to be working and there's no more space to innovate or to improve?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think the cure is to start many things, so you get less ego attached to each one of them. But that's maybe a cop-out answer, because yeah, I don't have a clear answer, to be honest, about like when exactly. But in general, I think at least we work in a way where we try to sort of get pulled along by demand from real customers. So if we do a few experiments and nobody cares, or like there isn't clear purchase intent, or we don't get any forms of validation from customers, either in terms of willingness to pay or to like sign up to receive more information or to do calls with us or anything like that, if there's no response, we typically move on.
And you had a good, sorry.
Yeah, but it's hard to make it generalizable because there's so many variables, right? It might be, the timing might be wrong and the idea might be good. The idea might be good, but you're thinking you have the wrong idea about who the customer is. So maybe it would work if you target a different customer group. Maybe the idea is bad, but the problem you're solving is worth solving in a different way. All that kind of stuff. But I think also a generally good practice to follow is to try to start with problems instead of ideas. So if you have a problem that you understand and that you can talk to customers about and learn about and get insight around, it's often many ways, many ideas that can solve a single problem. Whereas if you start with a genius idea and you sort of go searching for a problem to solve with it, that has in my experience, it's a rarer thing to make that work. Okay, Sahil.
So I've just checked out the website of River, and I see that River was earlier called as like Euro Maker or Troublemaker in English. So
That's right.
why was it so like this?
Why?
Why was it called like this, Troublemaker?
We just thought it was cool, man. We just thought it was an edgy name, and we wanted to make some constructive trouble in client organizations. So we basically had this rationale around all positive change starts with somebody challenging you or something like that, and we wanted to sort of be the constructive challengers or troublemakers. So we were called that for a year and a half, 2 years. The only problem was that it scared sort of boring customers away, or it scared too many decision makers away. So it was a very cool name to be called when you invited your friends to office parties, but it wasn't that easy to get into the boardroom with very expensive executives in suits and try to make them pay you millions of kroner. So then we changed the name.
Is it still bootstrapped or is it planning to raise funds for it?
Yeah, we're completely bootstrapped for now. And our sort of long-term vision is to become a startup studio where we basically incubate startups and get them to product market fit. And then after that, we can raise capital for each case and then build a team around it. But we want the mothership, Braver, to be self-funded so we can control it ourselves. And YC basically. But I think we want to, at least in the beginning, start with our own ideas instead of like have people apply to a program. So that's the plan, the long-term plan. And then instead of going the VC route and just like raising a massive fund, we try to do it one step at a time and like self-finance it through consulting projects and remote work and other stunts.
Yeah, cool. I also have a question.
Okay, bring it on.
What made you want to go into innovation instead of going? You mentioned that you were an NHH student, so
Yep.
Instead of going like the traditional business routes, what made you choose innovation over that?
Well, can I say this in a non-cynical way? So I started business school, right? And then I went to the first lecture on small business management or whatever it was called. And it took about 17 minutes until I realized that this is incredibly dull. Like trying to figure out somebody else's accounting and all that kind of stuff. And then, but I went through, completed the studies, and like spent my time on other things. And then throughout my study time, I started a company with some friends, and we did that for a year and a half. And then we did like literally every single beginner's mistake in the entrepreneurship playbook. We did all of them. So we fucked up on a daily basis for 2 years, a year and a half. And then mysteriously we managed to sell the company to a competitor. And then after that, I sort of went back to school, finished my master's, and then I got a real job in a big consultancy. And then when I started there, it took like 48 hours until I was sold out on a project that was pretty boring, to be fair. And then I sat at this project like trying to solve their problems instead of coming up with problems I wanted to solve. And then I think it took 88 days until I was out. And then my co-founder and I just decided to try to build our own thing instead. So I think that the short answer is just that I think it's just way more fun, really. And I'm quite an individualist, and it's very important to me to control my own time and my own focus. And I didn't really see that was possible in a traditional employment setting. And I also like to be exposed to the upside of the things I'm working on or the value that I'm creating. And that's kind of the problem with having a regular job, right? You don't really have any incentives to go above and beyond your call of duty, so to speak. If we take the Homo economicus, rational person hypothesis into play, whereas when you're building your own thing, it's the buck stops with you, right? So if it goes down the drain, you go down the drain as well. But if it goes well, at least you're take part in the upside, which is a much more interesting, gives me much more reason to get up in the morning and sort of go for it, I guess. And maybe a cliche answer, but it's a cliche for a reason.
Thank you.
Anytime. Selina, I see a hand in front of your black box.
Okay, wait, is this fine?
Hey, yay!
Hi.
See you now. Hello.
All right. I had a question on the process of coming up with a startup. Like you mentioned, you go through a process of trial and error. And for me, that makes sense because you are trying out something and you want to figure out what's going to work. But then I'm also thinking about efficiency, because in as much as this trial and error, I want to make sure that I'm efficient and I'm not just wasting things. So is there a way that you can go about improving efficiency when you're doing this thing, or is it just expected?
Yeah, I think it's quite dangerous to try to be efficient in the very beginning of a startup case. But I think it's important to try to be effective. And that means it's especially in Norwegian, when we translate those two words, we get the same Norwegian word, effective, which is kind of effektivitet, which is problematic. Because in English they mean two completely different things.
Yeah.
And the way I look at it is that being effective means building the right or like figuring out what the right thing to do is. Whereas being efficient is about doing it right. So doing it in a cost-effective manner, spending as few resources you can, trying to optimize your processes and so on. But in the beginning, you don't know what you should optimize. So it's very problematic to get stuck in optimization mode too early. And I know this because I go there very quickly myself. I have sort of like an optimizer's mind. So I like to make things look nice and like, set up great systems and all that kind of stuff. But if you get stuck in that too soon or too early, you often end up spending a lot of time making great systems that don't create any business value and they don't solve customer problems. So what I would optimize for in the beginning is, I think there's a trade-off between speed and quality. And in the beginning, you only want to be in the speed department. So you want to like try as many things as you can as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible, because most of those things are going to fail anyway, because you don't really know what you're doing. So you just need to like try as much as you can, as fast and as simply and cheaply as you can. And then when you start to hit something that works, and maybe you get to product market fit, you get some customers, maybe you have a basic product that kind of works, then you can start to gradually move towards a bit more quality and sort of like do things right. Because then you've already figured out what the right thing to do is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And
Thank you for the question.
Could you explain a bit on scenario planning? I think that was the word. It's the first time I've heard of it. So if you could explain what it means.
Yeah, it basically means it's kind of like the professional version of tarot cards, you know, where you have this crazy magic ladies who sit in cars, and then you can go in there and they will tell you your future by looking into a crystal ball. It's basically that in a professional setting, meaning you try to peek into the future and come up with some kind of hypotheses about things that might happen, or how scenarios that might play out, right, in the future. So when we did our COVID scenario planning in March, we basically said, okay, in the worst case scenario, this thing is like the new Spanish flu, right? It wipes out half the population. We have to be completely shut down from the world for the next 5 years. Everything is going to complete eradication. That was the absolute worst case scenario. And then we didn't think that was very likely. So we didn't really consider that too much because the probability was too low. But then there was a range of possible scenarios that we thought was pretty high probability. For example, that this wouldn't really play out at all. It was just the best case scenario. It would just be like a 2-month panic, and then that would be the end of it. And then the medium scenario was sort of, okay, maybe we have to change parts of our lives, but it's not as big a change as in the worst case, and so on and so forth. So it basically just means trying to come up with various versions of the future that are some degree of likely, and then based on, let's say, 3 or 4 different possible futures, try to sort of play the clock back to today and think, what should I do today in my life or in my company to make sure I benefit, or at least don't get wiped out by any of these scenarios. And that's obviously easier said than done, because predicting the future is difficult, and also it's often a trade-off, right? It's if you want to only hedge against the downside and cap the downside from the worst case scenario, you have to do a certain thing today. Whereas instead, if you want to optimize for getting a boost from the best case scenario, maybe you have to do something completely different today. So that's sort of like where the strategy comes into play.
Thank you.
Okay, we're running out of questions. Seems like it. All right, guys. Thank you for hanging around. Great to see you all.
Yes, and also thank you to you for having this workshop and teaching us lots of new stuff about innovation and how to create a new product.
Yeah, this was fun.
Brand.
Goodbye.